All right, good afternoon everybody and welcome. So this is yet another tutorial video for using HTML and CSS for IAT 235 and for Simon Fraser University. This time we're still going to be working primarily with CSS, but whereas last time was sort of basic styling, this time we're going to get into how you can make use of HTML and CSS to control the layout of your website and the content on that website. The specific tool slash method that we're going to be using for this tutorial is that we're going to be using a set of CSS instructions surrounding what's known as flexbox. And I'm going to go over some basics of flexbox, but if you want to learn more, I cannot recommend CSS Tricks Complete Guide to Flexbox more highly. Anything that I'm teaching in this video is the result of learning that I did from going through that reading and then going through some web tutorial games and then practicing and then reaching a point where I can show this to you. This is also not the only way that you can do layout in CSS. There's also another sort of competing slash companion standard that are both sort of in active development right now that is known as CSS Grid. And so it's perfectly possible to do good layouts with Flexbox or CSS Grid. Their adoption across browsers are relatively similar. Most modern browsers have no problem with them, other than I think Microsoft is lagging behind a little bit in adoption, as is historically common. So generally these can be implemented with minimal difficulty and will work much better than the way that it had to be done in the past, which would have been working with floats and or tables or other things where we were hacking the things that already existed into tools that we can use for layout. So that's where that stuff's going to go. So our goal today when it comes to the website that you see in front of me is we want to set up multi-column grids that allow for a couple things. The first thing we want to do is we want to get this navigation bar, and we want to set it up in such a way that rather than just sort of like sitting along the left here, these navigation buttons span out and take up the entire width of the page. And then the other thing we want to do is we want to take this kitten and then we want to take this puppy and we want to get them sitting side by side in a two-column layout instead of sitting one on top of each other as they currently are. So without any CSS styling, without any changes to the HTML, the thing to note right now is this one is governed by a section tag and this one's governed by a section tag, both of which are block level elements, which means they take up the full width of the browser window and they stack on top of each other. And so we are going to create containers for these two sections, and then we're going to make those containers into flex elements so they can sit side by side and resize responsively depending on the size of the browser window. So that's our ultimate goal. And to do that, we're going to head into our text editor, and we're going to start dealing with our HTML and CSS. So although most of the work that we're going to do in this tutorial is going to be happening in a CSS file, there's a few things that we need to do in the HTML to get that going. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a link for a future CSS file that we're going to create in this tutorial. And we're going to name this one specifically grid.css. Now, we don't technically have to do this. You could put all your grid instructions inside the main.css file and that would be fine. The reason why I'm separating this out is because the layout portions of my CSS serve a very different function than the sort of the visual and typographic information that was going into the main.css. And for just ease of reading and editing and finding, I tend to like to have sort of like CSS files that are tied to specific sort of functional requirements for my site so that I can get to them and deal with them quicker. And also so that I can easily copy and paste them between other web projects, because once you've got a layout grid functioning, oftentimes that layout grid can work in a lot of other settings as well. So that's why I do it. It's not required, but it's just a thing that you might find kind of handy. So then the next thing we're going to do is we need to make some slight edits to our navigation HTML, and we need to make some edits to the overall layout that we've got down here to prepare this file for the grids that are going to come in. So there's a few ways that you can do this, and one thing that's really important to note is any any element in HTML can theoretically become flexbox elements. You don't have to apply this to divs or sections or other things if you can find a way to make it work with sort of semantic tags. That said, divs can be very useful as a way of creating containers that then can sort of sit side by side and move together, and is one of the main places where we make use of divs these days when setting up grids in HTML and CSS. So we can do it in a couple of ways. Regardless of the way that you do it, though, you're going to have to set something to be a flex container, and then the things inside of it, the children of that thing, are considered flex objects. And so in the case of our navigation, we've got a bunch of anchor tags that are all children of nav. So if I went into the CSS, I could just make all navs flex objects or flex containers, but that's not really the best way to do it, because not all navs are ever going to need to be. And also the other thing to note is the instructions for starting a grid, or specifically a flex grid, can be repeated across a lot of different elements. And so if you've got something that's going to be repeating across multiple elements, that's usually when you're going to want to add a class. And so in this case, we're going to class equals, and we're going to set this class as box. And that is going to be what we're going to use to denote flex containers on this page. We're also going to give it a class of nav main, which is just going to hook in some navigation styling that's unique to this nav, so that if we have other nav elements in the future, this one will be sort of set and operate and act as if it's sort of our main file. And then as we sort of go through our anchors, we're going to add a few classes to these ones as well. So in this case, the class that we're going to add to these is going to be set as both nav-main-item, so we can tell, so we've got the main nav and then we've got the items that are inside it. And we're also going to say box item nav, which is instructions that we apply to basically flex children that are navigation items. And so we could just do that with all of them, but to make this faster, I'm just going to catch this and I'm going to copy and paste on the others. And a thing to note, if you've never dealt with sort of classes in HTML before, is to note that items can have multiple classes, as you see here, and as long as there's a space between the words, then each one of these is considered its own sort of class attribute that ties to the other thing. And so if I do, we're going to come back to this HTML file in a little while, because we're going to do some stuff with the kittens to do things that are a little bit more complex. But we're just going to sort of begin now with this, because this is the main thing that we need. So we're going to save that, and we're going to also head over to our CSS. But we're not going to do it in these two files, because we've linked a new CSS file. So to do that, let's go in here, and let's make ourselves a new file. And let us save that file. I'm going to put it in our CSS area, and we're going to call it grid.css. And so the grid.css has a few things that we're going to need. So one of the first things to note is that for the purposes of this layout, we're going to try and make something a little bit easier on us by changing the box model. So in this tutorial, I'm not going to really talk about what the box model is. That's something that happens in my lecture. If you're coming into this from somewhere other than my own teaching course, you can look this up. But just know that we're changing the box model so that when we set width and height properties, the way that we set that width and height is going to work more consistently and more predictably, because we're going to have the size of elements be sort of a little bit closer. So how we're going to do this is we're going to use an asterisk selector, which means we're asking this instruction to apply to everything. And we're going to say box sizing, and then we're going to set it to border box, which is going to make it, when we set width now, that width is going to entail the content, the padding, and the border of this. And so that should hopefully make our sizing be a bit more predictable. The second thing we need to do is we need to declare the instructions for our flex container. And so it's an interesting thing to note with flex is that there's some things that are specifically meant to be applied to the container with flexbox objects within them that will govern things like the layout of the elements. So whether this is supposed to be a sort of column grid, whether it's a row grid, whether those columns are supposed to be organized by reverse or by in front, whether or not how they handle space, how they wrap, all those sorts of things that govern, how the grid itself actually works, we're going to set in our grid container. And so the first thing you have to do that is you have to declare it a grid container, which you do by setting its display property to box. Then once you've done that, you can start to set other controls. Sorry, I said box, idiot. Set the display property to flex, which is going to define this as a flexbox container. And then once I've done this, we can start to set the various properties that relate to the flex container itself. So with this object that's display flex, we then can set things like flex wrap. So with flex wrap, what this is basically saying is if I don't set the flex wrap, everything will try and fit in the width of the page. If it turns out that the items can't fit, what do they do? And with flex wrap, the answer will be, if we set it to wrap, then they will drop underneath each other. The other thing that we can often set, and that we're going to do to start, is we're going to set our justify content. And so this is an instruction that's going to relate to how the various flex children, which in the case of our nav bar are going to be a series of anchors, sort of how they space themselves out. And so we're right now going to set this to space around, which is going to set sort of like how those things is sort of spaced out. And in this case, what that tends to look like is that the extra space outside of the content is going to be sort of increased or decreased within the element so that the space can sit there. So the other thing that we're going to do before we head back is we're going to set our box item nav, which is going to set some instructions that are related to the flexbox item itself. And in this case, we're going to do this writing it out long form, just so you can see it more clearly. So in this case, we're going to say flex grow, which we're going to set to 1, flex shrink, which we're going to set to 1, and then flex basis, which we're going to set to auto. So the thing to note with this is grow defines sort of like the ability for the item to fill the extra space. Shrink is sort of like exactly how it works when it's trying to shrink to fit. And then the flex basis is the default size of the element before the extra space is distributed. And so with auto, what that's basically generally saying is sort of set the size automatically based on the size of the content or the size that's set somewhere else related to the element. So if we save all of this, and if we head back over to our page, we should be able to reload this and then see that these are looking a lot different. And so you'll see that each one of them is equal in size. The content itself is different, and so there's a slight difference in width, but the space left that's there beside that sort of causes that to fit in a little bit of a different way. And depending on whatever else you want to do, if you wanted to sort of set that layout so it looked a little bit more like a button, you could potentially do that. Like we could go into our main.css as an example, and there should be a nav main item somewhere in here. And if we haven't set it, looks like maybe I haven't put that in there. Yeah, I don't have it. Oh, there it is. So we've got sort of these things which are otherwise just sort of trying to set the way that these buttons look. And so one thing that we could do is we could say, if we save that, and then we go back here, and now they sort of look more like navigation buttons in a different way. So as we resize this again, you can see that the space left and right now is equal for each one of them, and then they try and stay that way. And then when they get so small that the text can't fit, then they start to do that, and they start to drop underneath. And thus we get this fluid responsive grid that just sort of works out of the box, which is great. So there's other things we can do with this, but that basically gets us a navigation thing that's largely working. So we're going to sort of leave that there. And the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to go back and we're going to try and get our our content grids instead of our navigation grids working. And to do that, we're going to do something a little more complicated this time. So let's just get that started. So in this case, rather than applying these instructions to our sections themselves, we want these sections to be able to sort of move as their own units. And so we want these sections to be flex children. And technically, actually, we want them to be inside the flex children. So we're going to set up the grid in a bit of a different way. So how we're going to do it this time is we're going to have a div tag, which is semantically inert. There's no sort of expectations that it's describing content at all. So when we need HTML elements that are purely for layout and are oftentimes going to be some form of invisible, divs are in their element at that point. That's where they're happiest. So in this case, we're going to set a div, and we're going to give it a class of box. And that's going to be our container. And so because both of the sections are meant to live within this flex container, that means at the bottom here, beneath the section, we would have our closing div. And so one thing that I do that you may find useful is I try and make sure that when I'm dealing with, because divs are semantically inert, we don't really know what they're describing, they often have classes applied to them, but if they appear in such a way that you can't see the starting class name, then you may not know what this div is that's ending. So I like to go end of and just say what that div's class is so I can keep that identified. And you'll see why this is going to matter in a minute, because the container is the one thing we set up, but then we're also going to set up a grid column container, which we're going to call and so then at the end of the section, because that's the first where we want the first column to end, we're going to create a closing div. And I'm going to use the same system as I did before. And then right above the puppies, we're going to open a second column. And again, we're going to give it a class equals box item 1 of 2. And then down, 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 and this is where you see how this can start to become useful, because we've got two divs that are each ending one after another. And so this helps me just know what the heck I'm looking at. And then in the interests of good indenting, let's get that there. And get that all set up. And so that should be all we need to get this starting. So let's save that, and let's get back into here. Oh no, that's the website. That's not where we need to go. Let's get back to our grid.css, and this time around, instead of box item nav, we are going to deal with box item 1 of 2. And we're not going to set too much to this one. I'm just going to set, again, the flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. This time I'm going to do it with a shorthand. So flex 1, 1, 50%. So what this basically means is grow 1, shrink 1, basis 50%. So in this case, because we are specifying the column specifically as 50%, that's going to say basically this the size, in this case width is generally going to be the width, should be 50% of its container, and the container is going to be the div that was class box. And that should be all we need to start. So we save that, and then we head over here and we reload. We see them sitting side by side now. Yay. And then as it resizes, they try and fit. They try and resize the images just for everything to fit, until eventually you can't get any smaller. So one thing to note with that is, and let's just go to our inspect for a second so we can get that really nice and tight and thin, is eventually you'll get to a point where it can't get any thinner, and then it'll stack one on top of the other. But one of the things that you may note is that you may find that the width and height, the content looks bad before the system was willing to have that happen. So if I'm looking at it at a sort of like this width here, which is around 450, those images are way too small. So I would think that maybe, probably somewhere in the range of like, let's say like 600 pixels or so, we probably want those things to be sitting one on top of another back to full column. And so to make that happen, what we're going to do in here is we are going to set a media query, which is written as, sorry, that's a little low on the screen, isn't it? Let's do this up here where you can see it. At media, and then an argument, which in this case we're going to set this as max width. And specifically, instead of saying 600 pixels, I'm going to say 50M. So what happens there is we're basing this off of the root font size. With a media query, generally because it's looking at the max width of the window, that 50M is going to be sort of the root font size. And so this allows us to, again, have this be more consistent related to whether someone has changed the default font size. So if someone's using an accessibility tool or is otherwise doing something, we have our sizes happening proportionally rather than just using an arbitrary choice of 600 pixels. And then in the media query, what it basically means here is if this is true, basically, if the browser window is between 0 and 50 ems wide, do these instructions. And in this case, what we're going to say is box item 1 of 2. And I should probably put the class dot on there, shouldn't I? And we're going to say flex basis 100%. And so what that should do, and by the way, this isn't the only way you can do this. You could also do this by setting the flex direction of this box here to be a column instead of a row, and this will do the same thing. But we're going to do it with just with width. So by setting that to 100%, and because of the way the flex wrap is already working, we should then be able to go here and see them stack like we intended. And if we resize this, okay, so I'm having that happen way sooner than necessary. So I can probably drop the M's a little bit. Let's say 30. Reload. Yeah, close enough. And we get them stacking now. So that's not the only thing that we can do. One of the things that's nice with Flexbox in particular is that you can have sort of like grids within grids set up as well. So right now we've got in our HTML, we've got, this div class box, and then we've got this box item 1 of 2, and then we've got this other box item 1 of 2, and that's coming along just fine. And so the other thing that we can do if we want is we could go into these elements themselves and say above, just below the H2, we could say div class equals box. And then we are going to end that just before the end of the section. So this is a second container. And then we're going to have I'm going to remember to put our quotation marks in. And then we're going to finish that below the figure. And then we're going to make another one And so we don't actually have to change anything in the CSS here because these classes already are written. And so we should be able to go in here, reload this, and have these now sit side by side from the beginning, which is pretty cool. And then we could have a situation where as we're resizing our window, you may find that that makes this look bad a lot sooner. And so you might want to set up another media query. Say at that, say about, maybe about 900 pixels, things start to look bad. And so we could go in here and we could go into the grid.css and we could set this up again. And so we could set a separate media query that says at media, max width. I'm going to assume 50M for a second, but let's actually be a little bit less guessy this time. And so we're just going to pull up a calculator very quickly. And we're going to say 960 pixels divided by our default font size. Well, it's 60. Okay, so 60M. Cool. Now, if I just said dot box item nav again, or one of two, and set the flex basis, then this isn't going to work. Partly, of course, because I've got a typo up here. But one way or the other, this won't work because this will apply itself to both the box item one of two here, and so we're going to end up with both of our grids going to 100%. So we're going to do something a little different here. And the fun thing is because of the way that CSS works, it applies the sort of most specific instruction. And so how we're going to deal with this is we're going to go here and we're going to let's look at our HTML for a second and just see where this can work. So in this case, what we're wanting to do here is we've got a box item one of two here, and we've got a box item one of two here. But in this case, this div is just a child of div, which is itself just a child of whatever, body or whatever it is. Whereas this one of two, or where is it? This guy here, is also a child of section. And so that's something that we might be able to use. And so we can say something in here that basically says section div dot. And so that's basically saying a div that's a child of a div that's a child of a section. Whether we need this one, I'm honestly not entirely sure. The other thing that we could do is we could say, now this works. We could say like something like dot, or sorry, ID. So an item with that, it's got a div with that, and that should sometimes make it work. So I'm going to test it with just the one div, just so I can see whether that works. Looks like it did. And then we'll get even thinner. We apply the other one. So you see two media queries happening separately because we told it to act on only a more specific thing. There's other ways we could have done that, probably more elegant ways we could have done that. We could have gone in here and just like set up a class on these ones here. And there's a few different things we could do, but that basically gets that layout happening the way we had intended. So that's the main stuff that we have to do. There's honestly, there's nothing else particularly complicated about it. There's a lot more that you can do. So yeah, but that's sort of like the simple part of layout. It can of course get a lot more complicated. You can end up with, columns of 3, columns of 5. You can have multiple rows with multiple different containers. There's lots more you can do, but this will be enough to get you started. And then coupling with the other, honestly, better tutorials that you have access to, you'll be able to get through this without too much trouble. So hope this is of use to you, and good luck on your web designing. Talk later.